we now hand over to the last of our speakers for this session, Jana. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the Sentencing Council for the invitation to. So I'm a consultant psychiatrist and have been since 2010 working in a range of forensic intellectual disability services, most recently at the State Hospital. And what I'll seek to cover in the 15 minutes that I have is key aspects of issues around autism and intellectual disability as relevant to the criminal justice system. So the first point I just wanted to raise is this slide that Suzanne has already shown looking at prevalence. And what I would point out is that when you look at population rates versus rates within criminal justice systems, there's a slight overrepresentation of people with intellectual disability, around 7%, and these are worldwide figures. And for autism, and this might be surprising for some people in the audience, there is no overrepresentation. It is population rates that you find in the criminal justice system. So when we think about autism, we have the two main classification systems, the ICD-11 and the DSM-5. But just in broad terms, the deficits are around social and communication on the one hand, and on the other hand, cognitive rigidity and repetitive behaviors as the main components. And the importance of thinking about autism is that it's a developmental disorder. So those deficits start early in life and are persistent. And I'm emphasizing that because autistic traits, things associated with autism, are common across the population, and that's different from people who meet diagnostic criteria for autism as defined. So within diagnostic, looking at the diagnostic challenges in forensic settings, we know within forensic settings there's high levels of childhood adversity, including abuse and neglect, and that those things in and of themselves cause communication and social deficits. And so superficially at least, people can appear as if they have autism because of other factors relevant to their backgrounds. And that's why sometimes people have this impression it might be overrepresented. But the key to the diagnosis is that developmental history, what happened in early life and how did the person present in early life. So there's been a number of studies around this. The ones that are most robust are the ones with our controls. This particular study from Scandinavia followed up population cohorts, looking at siblings to help control for environmental factors. And they demonstrate what has been rather consistent in the literature, that autism by itself does not predispose you to violent criminality, although ADHD did increase that risk, as did tic disorders. What we know from the published literature is that people with autism as diagnosed with the criteria are actually either less likely or as likely as everyone else to commit offenses. And if you think about it, people could be considered at low risk of offending because they generally like to have rules to help navigate the world, and laws are in essence social rules about how you should conduct yourself. The difficulty is, in the people with autism who tend to come into the criminal justice system, is you need to firstly know what is the rule, so you need to have awareness of what the rule is, but also you need to want to follow the rule. And it's that second part that is often the challenge when people with autism are within the criminal justice system, where they may be resistant to accepting that there are other people's rules that they have to follow. And that's often associated with narcissistic traits, which is associated with violent offending, but is often not assessed within this particular group. So, autism by itself, as far as we can tell from the published research, is not associated with higher rates of serious violent offending. In people with autism who do commit offenses, there's almost always another co-occurring condition which is far more relevant to the offending risk and which needs to be addressed. And so therefore, if somebody with autism is within the criminal justice system, a priority should be to identify what other conditions may be present and should be identified and where they fit within the risk management. Special interest is something associated with autism and often attracts quite a lot of attention, and people sometimes will wonder whether an offense happened because of an autistic special interest. And just to be clear, these are not just interests or hobbies. This is an all-consuming fascination with a certain activity. And from what we can tell, and there's limited research on this, but from what we can tell is that it's actually very rare for any crime to be associated with a special interest. There is a defense that's sometimes put forward for people facing charges around child sexual exploitation offenders, the online offending, where it's said that they engage in that activity because it is an autistic special interest. Great care needs to be taken when considering that in terms of court procedures, because people who engage in that type of offending have the features I've listed there. Whether or not they have autism is not relevant. It's a feature of those type of offenders. So the fact that they've collected a massive collection that they could never watch in their whole entire lifetime does not mean they have autism. It's a feature of that pattern of offending. And a key factor in these cases is often around whether they've taken any steps to conceal what they are doing, because that would indicate that they know what they're doing is illegal, they shouldn't be doing it, and that it's wrong, which is very different from somebody who doesn't understand social norms and is engaging in activity on that basis. So cyber-dependent crime in general is sometimes associated with autism. And again, there's limited literature, but what we do have has that same pattern where people who meet diagnostic criteria for autism are actually no more likely to engage in that than anyone else. People with autistic traits are slightly overrepresented within that. So we don't have good evidence that that is a particular issue for people with autism. There have been systematic reviews to look at how autism features in the criminal justice system. This one from 2014, again, finding that people with autism are not disproportionately overrepresented. It was updated last year, and that finding has remained the same. When somebody does have autism and they are engaged in serious offending, for example, sexual offending, it can make their treatment exceptionally challenging. And this is because of the cognitive rigidity, which is really what it says on the tin. It is nigh on impossible to change the underlying cognitions, and there's been lots of published literature on this of heroic efforts to do so with very, very little success. And so these people are often the most difficult to treat clinically because you're not shifting the underlying cognitions, and therefore the aims of management then become around accepting you're not going to change the cognitions, but getting the person to accept that their behavior needs to change, or if they won't accept that, then it's about whatever external measures need to be put in place to ensure public safety. And that can be very challenging. So as a clinician practicing in this area, if somebody is engaging in serious offending and autism is part of the picture, it generally means everything's going to be a lot harder, and change is going to be more difficult, and reducing the risk is going to take longer or may not even be possible in some cases. So in Scotland, there's no specialist health service for people with autism who do not have a comorbid intellectual disability. Within forensic intellectual disability services, we commonly manage people who have both conditions. About a third of people will do that, but forensic mental health services have much less experience and generally are not really set up to meet those sorts of needs. Prison environments can be very challenging because they're very noisy places to be, but for some people, they actually find it helpful because it's very structured, it's very predictable. They can spend long periods of time in their cells away from other people. So it's a very individual thing. There's no blanket presumption that someone would not manage in prison because they have autism. It's also well recognized that they have an increased risk of developing serious mental illness like schizophrenia and a well-documented increased risk of suicide. So why should we try and identify whether people have autism or not? There is sometimes a lack of clarity of thinking around this, as I mentioned, because of the higher prevalence of autistic traits. So in a criminal justice setting, it's always really important to be clear about what the basis of any diagnosis was. Was it a robust, well thought through, thorough assessment that included the developmental history, because that is the only basis on which that diagnosis should be made. If it is present, then that should inform the individual formulation. And most importantly, being clear about what is the relevance of autism in terms of the offense. Is there any link? Is there no link? Are there only implications for management? There are highly likely to be communication and sensory needs that would need to be addressed. And again, the higher risk of co-occurring conditions means that a thorough assessment is needed. And I think what's really important is to avoid diagnostic overshadowing. And this seems to happen quite a lot if somebody has a diagnosis of autism, where almost any behavior or any feature is attributed to autism to the exclusion of alternative formulations or alternative diagnoses. And it's quite unhelpful in terms of risk management and general management. So moving on quickly then to intellectual disability. So this is synonymous with learning disability in terms of terminology in the UK. And the definition from the British Psychological Society highlights the 3 criteria, which is significantly below average intellectual functioning, usually assessed on cognitive assessment like a WACE, significantly impaired ability to function, and again, it's a developmental disorder, so the difficulties have been present since childhood and have been persistent. It's about 1% to 2% of the population. The vast majority live in the community. A small proportion will ever require any sort of inpatient care, and an even smaller proportion would come in contact with the criminal justice system. In the census done in 2018, we had 85 patients with intellectual disability in forensic inpatient settings, the vast majority of whom were male. So it can be difficult to have a mental image of who we're talking about. So, and there's not many portrayals in popular media, but when you look at the scale of different types of offending, if people are familiar with the film The Angels Share, and if you're not, I recommend it. One of the characters who has quite thick glasses, so people who've seen it, represents the kind of low-level offending where if you were not in that particular peer group, you would not have engaged in whatever the offending behavior was, but you were drawn into that sort of thing. I need to stop hitting the microphone. And at the more serious end is, for example, in Of Mice of Men by John Steinbeck, where a person has social impairments, probably sensory needs to touch a young woman's hair, the situation gets out of control, he's poor problem solving, poor impulse control, and he ends up committing a homicide. And that's the more serious end, and that's just if you kind of mentally keep that sort of image of who we're talking about in this group. So looking at some of the prevalence then, again, the evidence base has its challenges because often people will only have done intelligence testing, they won't have looked at the developmental history, so the numbers have to be taken on that understanding. But within the UK, in the study of 2011, it was 4% of convicted prisoners. In Norway, it was slightly higher, and it's in that sort of range anyway. So when you compare the forensic ID group with the forensic mental health patient group, it's a very different cohort. So only 1/3 of the patients will have a serious mental illness like schizophrenia. The majority don't. There's high levels of other co-occurring conditions, like we already mentioned, FASD, genetic disorders, ADHD, and autism. This is a highly complex clinical group in that they have lots of other physical health comorbidities, like epilepsy and various other things. And the vast majority have significant communication impairments, as well as high levels of sensory impairments and sensitivities. Okay. So within Scotland, we've already covered the estate. I've just quickly put up there what's available for forensic ID across Scotland. And as we mentioned, there are about 17% of the forensic inpatient population. This particular follow-up of the patient group showed that over a 5-year period, just under half moved to a lower level of security, just showing that people make progress and they do have a trajectory that is positive. And again, this study that followed up these patients from the state hospital over 20 years found that the intellectual disability group in particular were protected from premature mortality, which was mentioned earlier. That group actually did well, even compared to community ID people, probably because of the nature of the healthcare that's provided within that setting. Bill Lindsay and his colleagues did a 20-year follow-up of a forensic immunity team, which again showed some really encouraging results where there was a 90%, just over 90% reduction in offending incidents after the input of the service. There was recidivism, and obviously we would hope that that would have been lower, but I think that does show the effectiveness of the range of interventions. So not everyone with an intellectual disability will be diverted away from a prison setting, and many people can manage within a prison setting. When people are not going to be suitable for that really depends on how they can safeguard themselves in terms of vulnerability, whether they've got co-occurring mental health issues that will worsen in the prison setting, and whether they need any specialist programs that would not be available in prison. And just very briefly, there's a lot of discussion at the moment around the definitions of mental disorder and what should be in and out of the definition of mental disorder, with some discussion around whether learning disability should be removed from that. So just to highlight the New Zealand experience, where they did do that in 1992, which caused a high level of public concern because a number of individuals posing a high risk to the public could no longer be detained and were in the community causing issues in terms of public safety. And so they ended up having to do separate legislation in 2004 that was only targeted at that specific group, which replicated everything within the Mental Health Act. It also meant that more people with learning disability went to prison. They lost a lot of their clinical expertise during that period in the country, and then had to recruit a number of people from the UK to go over eventually to help set that back up again. And there were absolutely no benefits identified for either the physical or mental health outcomes for people with learning disability. And I'll end there. Thanks very much.